Our next speaker is Dr. Eric Jean-Pierre, is a senior lecturer in the Department of Law and model leader for international and comparative law in international criminal and human rights law at Kingston University. His research expertise and interests focuses on comparative law and in the relationship between Africa and international law and international justice. He's a founding member and joint director of the Globalization and the Law Group at Kingston University. He previously taught at City University, the University of Surrey, and the University of North London. Also, he was a visiting lecturer at the University of Maribor, Slovenia, and Nicolas Lemire University, Lithuania, and he taught aspects of legal translations in the linguistics department at City University. Please welcome him.
Okay, well, it's better to clap at before I speak. Who knows how much you will like it or not, this talk. So, well, thank you very much anyway for being here. I know that the weather is absolutely lovely, unless you are like me and you suffer from hay fever, which means that I'm much happier in this room than outside. So today I will be talking to you about the Western Sahara, and it all really originates with this picture or similar picture that my nephew sent me, and it was a picture of him windsurfing in the Western Sahara. And I thought, wow, it has become a tourist destination now as well. And it is really all about the fact that we have a certain status quo existing in the Western Sahara in relation to a situation that is quite similar, really, in some proportions to Palestine, for instance, but where really the media tend to shun and ignore the issue to a much greater extent than is the case for Palestine. So Western Sahara is this little piece of land that is just down south of Morocco, and there are a number of issues that relate to it. So first, the Western Sahara is a non-self-governing territory, and I will be talking about that and that concept as well under international law. There is a wall that separates as well the territory controlled by the Moroccan government and the territory that is controlled by the opposition liberation movement of the Polisario Front. But it's been going on, as you can see, for quite a while, and it's really led to a very imperfect situation that has remained as it is, really very much untouched for nearly 40 years. So it is what we would call a frozen conflict, a conflict that time has forgotten, really. 16 years of armed conflict, but then after, since then, there have been 27 years where peacemaking and all the different ideas and efforts have not come to fruition. And also, what we will see and what I will be talking about a little bit, but obviously is the fact that since 2011 there hasn't been really very much change in the Western Sahara, and the Arab Spring overall has not really had any major impacts in Western Sahara. I mean, we had the first speaker this morning who mentioned already that Morocco had been and the Moroccan monarchy had been very astute in dealing with potential uprisings and demonstrations, and that has also been the case in relation to the Western Saharan territory. So I'm first going to be talking a little bit about how we got to the stage we're at the moment and explain what that stage is. And I will then talk, because obviously I'm a lawyer more than a political scientist, I will be talking as well about the law that is relevant to this. And I will conclude by talking about, since the Arab Spring and since 2011, the different events that might have an impact at some point on the Western Sahara situation. So first, the Western Sahara was previously known as the Spanish Western Sahara, so it was a Spanish protectorate. So protectorate is really this kind of very loose type of colonialism where the Spanish governments, just like the French in Morocco as well, were mainly interested in controlling the coast, and the inland was being left very often to indigenous rulers. But it is really with the end of the Franco regime that Spain decided to withdraw from the Western Sahara. And it had initially as an aim to try to organize a referendum to allow the people to gain independence and gain a sovereign state if they wanted to. That was originally stopped by the neighboring countries of Mauritania and Morocco. A decision in 1975, a question then was taken to the International Court of Justice about the status of the Western Sahara, and I will be talking about that in a minute. But what we have subsequently was that Spain wanted, of course, to leave its African colonies and decided then to cede administrative control to the neighboring countries of Mauritania and Morocco. And very quickly, Morocco occupied 2/3 of the Western Sahara. That led to an conflict, an armed conflict with the Polisario Front that declared its desire to act as the government in exile, so based in Algiers, the main neighboring opponent to Morocco, as a government in exile, and to proclaim the existence of a country, of a state, the Saharan Arab Democratic Republic. And what we have as well is that a very large number of Sahrawis then were forced to flee the country and found refuge in mainly one refugee camp in Tindouf that is very much self-administered nowadays, and that has existed for over 40 years now. In 1984, we saw that Mauritania started taking less of an interest really in the Western Sahara, recognized it as well as a sovereign state, and recognized the government of the Polisario Front. But that, of course, was not the case in relation to Morocco. So what we then led was the end of the armed conflict in 1991, and that was really very much an effort that was led by the United Nations. They passed a number of Security Council resolutions where really they came up with a proposal about how to proceed once the ceasefire had taken place. And the aim was to organize a referendum, again, to determine the future of that territory. The problem really is that this seems to be, of course, a very good and laudable idea, but the problem was to determine exactly who would be the people who would be included in that referendum and who could participate in the referendum. So let the people decide, okay, but which people? There was a disagreement about the eligibility of the voters between Morocco and the Western Sahara. This was also made even worse by the fact that the Western Sahara first has got a nomadic population, so that really very often it was very difficult to determine whether certain of these nomads were from Mauritania, Morocco, or from the Western Sahara. So they very much had to rely, because of this unwritten culture, had very much to rely on the village elders to try to determine who they were. Spain had organized a census in 1974 to determine the amount of population, but it was a very incomplete census. And what at the same time Morocco started doing was to encourage settlers to come and emigrate into the West, Moroccan settlers to emigrate into the Western Sahara. And he tried to include those settlers as well among the eligibility voters. So we have nowadays this status quo whereby Morocco controls 80 to 85% of the territory, and it's very much along the coast. And there are a number of very important actors, really international actors, that probably play a role, not enough, but are trying at least to play a role. So the United Nations first, when it issued an advisory opinion in 1975 on the status of the Western Sahara, the Security Council that has always considered that this is a threat to peace and security in the region, and therefore it has taken control as well, and it has also enabled the creation of peacekeeping mission. The problem is that it's really very much a peacekeeping mission that hasn't got any teeth. It is one that is present, has been present since 1991, but is not even supposed to be monitoring human rights respects or not. However, it has been given the task of trying to organize as well the referendum. The other international player who is quite important as well is what was originally the Organization of African Unity, and since then the African Union, because both of these organizations accepted the Polisario Front's proposal of a sovereign state, so SADC, as one of its members. This led in 1984 Morocco then to leave the Organization of African Unity as well in protest. But since then, in 2017, Morocco has rejoined the African Union. So we have now an organization where both main players here have got possibly a forum where they can discuss their issues. But we will see as well that it's not necessarily for the benefit of the Polisario Front. And in addition to that, what we have seen in the last 3 years are two decisions by the European Court of Justice that have involved as well the Polisario Front, and that might have also an impact because it's got an economic impact, and therefore, of course, it might have on the long run a role to play. An unexpected role, but a role to play. And France, of course, is a very strong Moroccan ally, and therefore it has been blocking any condemnation of the Moroccan government about the way it deals in the Western Sahara by the Security Council. And that's, of course, freezing as well the involvement of the United Nations. And we have, of course, the other regional hegemon, the rival really of Morocco, Algeria, that has sided with the Polisario Front, and it has sided as well because of course it was at the time in the 1970s where decolonization was a big thing, and it provided support for these insurgency groups. So I want to talk very briefly about, I'll try to be brief at least, about the legal context on the international law, and I want to approach it as well by talking about the number of concepts that are very relevant really to this discussion. Oops. First is the fact that Morocco, in the way that it has acted, has de facto really annexed certain parts of the Western Sahara, and has possibly acted as well as an act of conquest. So I want to talk about whether these are lawful or not. And on the international, it's slightly complicated because you have a lot of these rules that are unwritten rules that don't exist in international treaty necessarily. And these unwritten rules are what we call customary international law. And how do we determine that? Well, we try to see what the practice of states is to determine whether this has created a certain rule. So it's very much like customary laws that you might have in your national legal systems. And there have been in the past annexation attempts. So East Timor, there was an attempt by Indonesia to annex it since 1975. There has been, of course, recently as well, Russia that has annexed Crimea, and both of them have been very controversial, and Indonesia was forced as well, when the change of government took place, to relinquish its claim over East Timor. But there have also been colonial enclaves so very small territories that were surrounded by newly or developing countries that have been allowed to be annexed and included within these states. So India, for instance, decided to annex Goa, that previously was part of Portugal or Portuguese colony. Ifni was previously also an enclave in Morocco, a Spanish enclave, and Morocco claimed it, and it was accepted. And what we have as a conclusion here is that it's perfectly well and acceptable under international law to annex certain territories if there is no opposition to it. If this annexation has to take place through force, then that is when it will be in breach of international law. And therefore, when it is acquired through force as well, it becomes really acts of conquest, which are unlawful under international law, as we've seen it when Kuwait was occupied by Iraq in the early 1990s. So what we have as well in this entire context, therefore, is the status of the Western Sahara. It's considered to be a non-self-governing territory. So what is that? That is mentioned under Article 73 of the UN Charter, and it has included as well the Western Sahara. So it's a territory whose people have not yet attained a full measure of self-government. So they need to be administered by another state. Just like Southwest Africa, for instance, was by South Africa, so before it became Namibia. Currently, we still have 17 non-self-governing territories, so they're mainly colonies, and mainly they are these very small islands, British territories, overseas territories. I think Britain has about 12 or 13 of these 17. But the Western Sahara is the only non-self-governing territory that is still left in Africa. And the aim when you are a state that is administrating a non-self-governing territory is to make sure that you act for the well-being of the people, of those people. And it is also to ensure that these non-self-governing territories will at some point be able to govern themselves, be able to attain independence. And that was as well, that is still the aim under law as well of this non-self-governing territory. But independence is not necessarily automatic. In general, it is what is taking place. And in general, it takes place under a very specific principle of international law that tries to avoid any chaos as well in the world order. And it's this principle of uti possidetis. The fact that newly independent states, former colonial territories, will keep the boundaries that their colonial masters had originally drawn. And that has been accepted by African states in the Cairo Declaration as well in 1964. And there are some benefits to it, of course, because it avoids conflicts between states about boundary disputes or territorial disputes. Every state knows more or less what its territory should be. But you have other options, and that's what General Assembly Resolution 1541 says. Non-self-governing territories may, for instance, decide that they want to integrate into an existing state. And we have a number of examples of that. What counts is really what is the will of the people, of those people who were under colonial oppression before. So we have had, for instance, in 1958, France gave the choice to its African territories whether they wanted larger autonomy but still to remain part of France, or whether they wanted independence. And all French African colonies except one, Guinea, decided that they at least initially wanted larger autonomy. A year later, that changed drastically. But you have other examples as well, like Mayotte and the Comoros Islands. These were a group of 4 islands in the Indian Ocean. And one of the islands, Mayotte, decided to remain part in a referendum part of France, and the other 3 decided to to become an independent country, the Comoros Islands. And you have East Germany as well that decided to unite, of course, with West Germany. So it is up to the will of the people. And I think it's also quite important to look at what really happened in practice at the time as well. 1975 and 1976, so it's this end of the Franco regime, and it was the end really of the whole decolonization process by Spain. All the other ones, all the other territories were allowed to become sovereign independent states. So whether it was initially Morocco, which rejoined with parts of the French Moroccan territory, and Equatorial Guinea, for instance. And if we look at that period of time, so mid-1970s, we see that it was really also the end of dictatorship in Portugal, and that also led to a Portuguese decolonization process. And they as well decided to become sovereign independent states. They had the choice, and all of them decided to become independent states. So that really leads us to believe that there is a very strong belief, really, that first and foremost, what the Western Saharan people should be entitled to do is to if they want to gain independence. We have a problem in international law, and that's this idea of really trying to square a circle. First, self-determination. Self-determination, it's about the rights of a people, so of individuals, of groups of people. The problem really is that international law overall doesn't really take into account people. International law, first and foremost, is about rules that regulate relations between states. So it's states that are the main actors of international law. They are the ones that have got rights. They are the ones that have got obligations, but mainly rights. That's why other entities are trying to become states, just like Palestine, for instance, like Somaliland, for instance, like a few other territories as well, because then they gain exactly the same rights as other states, and they may, if they are unhappy and another state breaches international law, they may then also take that other state to the International Court of Justice. And what we also have to bear in mind is that public international law is based on the consent of states. So states can, if they want to, decide that they do not want to be bound by a certain rule of international law. United States decide they don't want to be bound by the decision that you should not use landmines in armed conflict. Okay. They object then to the creation of that rule, and they don't have to follow that rule. So we have a number of issues. So what then becomes the problem is that these peoples, these groups of peoples or entities, the holy grail for them is to make sure that they become a state. Because if they become a state, then they will have a lot of rights. And we've also got another main problem, is that even if they've got these rights under international law, how will they enforce them? Especially if they are not a state. Because then they cannot go to certain institutions, they will not have locus standi, they will not have jurisdiction to go to them. So, to be independent, you need to be recognized as a state. So there's a number of concepts that have been, conditions that have been mentioned about it. 4 conditions mainly. You need to have a territory, a population, a government in control. That's all good for Western Sahara. The other 4th condition is more problematic. It's this capacity to enter into external relations with other states. Because at the moment we have about 40 states in the world that are willing to enter into diplomatic relations and recognize the Polisario Front as the recognized government of that territory. So we have about 160 who are, or 153 who are unwilling to do that. And recognition is essential. It doesn't work without. You know, my former African Studies prof used to say, one is a state, you're a state when other states say you are a state, even if you're just a van in a car park. Yeah. But nobody cares whether you look like a state, whether you act like a state, as long as they accept you as part of the club, then it all works. So I'm not going to talk very much about self-determination because I know that my time is running out, and I wanted to just mention a few more things. First, let's remember that it's all based on this idea of self-determination, the right of self-determination. So the right for people to determine their own destinies, free from tyranny. Yeah. That's a very philosophical and political concept. That's not necessarily what international law allows in absolute. There's a number of cases when it allows it. There's other cases when it doesn't allow it. So the International Court of Justice first determined that for the Western Sahara, the right to self-determination should apply. And it provided a definition to allow the people to freely express their will. Yeah. And that, of course, is again this right possibly to self-determination. We've got a number of resolutions that talk about it. And the one occasion when international law really at all times allows this right to self-determination is for former colonial territories. So the Western Sahara is such an example. So under international law, there is nothing that prevents it. The problem that we now have is the status quo, is the fact that Morocco cannot be forced, because it has got a number of allies at the Security Council mainly, cannot be forced really to enforce that referendum and to organize that referendum. But let's remember, it's not the general right to all people. Yeah? Ideally, yes, everyone would like to be able to say, yes, I live in a country that is organized, or in a territory that is organized in a way that I want it. But that doesn't work, because otherwise you would have this balkanization effect that really large states would then fall into pieces into smaller states, just like the former Yugoslavia is an example of, or the former Soviet Union as well. So I'm just going to finish with this. This is probably the most important for political science, at least. I think that in 2011 we come to a period that is quite interesting. 1991, when we had this ceasefire took place and the recognition that referendum should be taking place, it was an important moment because it was the end of the Cold War. It was the moment when you have really just a unipolar world where really the United States were controlling everything. And so they were able to have their will as well easily enforced. In 2011, we see, from 2011 onwards, we see a number of examples of possibly a kind of acceptance of a bottom-up democratic approach. So we have, of course, the Arab Spring, but the problem really in the Western Sahara is that there were a number of demonstrations, but in numbers compared to what our first speaker told us this morning in Morocco, it was in the hundreds that the demonstrators were counted, between 100 and 500, that the regime as well, the Moroccan regime, reacted and responded with force as well. And also the other problem is that these demonstrations mainly related to local issues, not to more general issues of governance, for instance, or general issues of independence. And they really came to an end very, very quickly. We have a number then of territories, possibly like Western Sahara, like South Sudan in 2011, that is allowed to become an independent state, to organize its own referendum and determine that it's become an independent state. We've got Britain, the UK, that decides as well to allow Scotland to organize a referendum as well. We've got Brexit as well, that is organized through a referendum. And we've got other entities that have struggled to gain statehood for a long time, like Kosovo and Palestine, that are starting to make some headway, at least legally. I know that in practice, and especially Palestine at the moment, we can see that it's not necessarily the case, but at least legally, Palestine being allowed to join UNESCO, being allowed to become a party to the International Criminal Court, in theory, nothing prevents it from taking any of its cases against Israel, if it has any, to the International Criminal Court. So we move closer to recognition. And also, I just want to finish with these. I've got just 2 more slides. First, it's the international influence that directly relates to the Western Sahara. First, the African Union. In 2012, we have a report of a fact-finding mission that is really encouraging and asking for this referendum to take place, for the self-determination of the Western Sahrawis to be taking place, and it's encouraging it. That now comes to an end, because now you have Morocco that is a member of the African Union, and it will block any such possibly future fact-finding missions or such decisions. And I think that's one of the reasons why it decided to rejoin. But we have the other main influence, which was quite unexpected, and it was the fact that we've had two decisions by the European Union that have put at least economic pressure on Morocco. The first of these was in 2015. The second one was just recently, so in February of this year. And both of them related to trade agreements between Morocco, favorable trade agreements between Morocco and the EU, where it seemed that a number of the goods that were going to be favorably imported into the European Union were being produced in the Western Saharan territories. So they were, very to the surprise of everyone, the General Court of the EU, so the first court, decided that the Polisario Front could take that case to European Court of Justice, that it was successful in challenging this trade agreement because it should not include the Western Sahara. When we talk about Morocco, we talk about the Moroccan accepted territory. We don't talk about this annexation of the Western Sahara. And there was also, for one of the first times as well, the recognition of, even if human rights are being breached abroad against non-EU citizens, the European Court of Justice will take an interest in it if it has an effect in Europe. So recently as well, the court has been a little bit less open in the most recent decision, but it has still considered that when Morocco talks about, in its trade agreement, about the territory of Morocco, the Moroccan fishing zone, it cannot include the Western Sahara. The problem with that, of course, is that how will one be able to check and control that is taking place? But at least there has been some advances there. So I just want to, this is my last slide. So what's happening now and for how much longer? So of course there hasn't been, we still are facing more or less a frozen conflict, and we're facing a frozen conflict as well because when you talk about entities gaining statehood, and we are seeing that in East Africa at the moment with Somaliland, for instance, as well, it is the international community tends to follow what the regional hegemon says. So for Somaliland, they will listen to what Ethiopia and Kenya say. For the Western Sahara, they will listen to what Algeria, but also what Morocco has to say about it. And also we know that this is a zero-sum game. So if the Polisario Front is satisfied with the outcome of the referendum, then Morocco will not be satisfied. There's so much to lose for each of the parties involved that they prefer the status quo to losing out in a final deal. So we need a new dynamic. It was hoped that this new dynamic would be the Arab Spring, would be the fact that there were other territories in the world that were suddenly becoming states or closer to states. Hasn't happened, but possibly now with the idea that we're getting more and more towards a multipolar world, and also the idea as well, I've heard recently that Russia is considering accepting Somaliland's quest for statehood. Possibly this might be beneficial as well for the Western Sahara. Okay, that's it. That's about it. Thank you very much for listening to me.
It's interesting because Western Sahara came up a day or so ago when we all heard about the Algerian plane crash. So is it Polisario?
Polisario, yeah.
Yeah. So allegedly 26 of their members were killed in the crash. How does this fit into the debate, if at all?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure. Yeah.
Very interesting.
You're right that at the end of the day, what matters really is that we talk about the Western Sahara. So however we talk about it, I think it matters. But there has been recently two events that have been even a little bit more important in last week. One has been the fact that Morocco has claimed that the Polisario Front has started being present in certain parts of the Western Sahara that they were not entitled to, and they've threatened to use force, and they've threatened as well Algeria about that as well. So there is a danger here as well that this kind of war by proxy might possibly be escalating. And secondly as well, the fact that the Polisario Front has now is claiming that the European Commission is trying to change its trade agreement with Morocco so as to include specifically and officially the Western Sahara into this trade agreement without consulting with the Polisario Front. But overall, otherwise, I hadn't really heard about the event.
Arabic,
yeah,
pages,
that's it. I mean, I get the impression that it's very. If you read the Guardians and so on, you will struggle to find more than one article every 6 months or a year on this. So I think the latest was really about David Silva, the Manchester City football player, and the fact that the Canary Islands are stealing sand from the Western Sahara apparently to make their pebble beaches into sandy beaches, and you haven't got the right to do that when you're on occupied territory. Yeah. But it is something we don't really talk about. I mean, these people are still there are ongoing human rights breaches that are taking place on a very regular basis by the Moroccan authorities. A number of Moroccan soldiers as well have been subject to the worst atrocities by the Polisario Front as well, and it is a situation that is very, very much reminiscent as well to Palestine in some ways as well, in the fact that you have something that was supposed to be temporary, refugee camps, that have become really something that has that is all that some people have ever experienced in their entire life. So it is a source of great concern. And the other concern as well is that ultimately we know that the organization of the referendum should be taking place. We know that really the Sahrawis should have the right for that, but that it's not enforceable. And that's what some of the problems are of international. It's all about just ensuring that states don't go to war for just any reason. It's trying to soothe a little bit the relations between states. It's not about caring what individuals think, and we're caring more and more, and that's what we're hearing. But that's why as well, when you hear Theresa May and the American administration and so on saying, poor people in Syria are being subject to chemical weapons, we're going to intervene. They're intervening in breach of international law because nothing allows them to do that under international law. But they're going beyond that because there are certain blockages. So there are certain complications sometimes with international law as well. And here the complication is that the Polisario Front in itself doesn't have much weight, doesn't have any rights really under international law. The only rights it now recently used was to go to certain international courts or to certain foreign courts. So they've gone to a British court, they've gone to European Court of Justice, but that's about it, to see some of their rights being enforced. But just raising a voice, but it's a very, very minimal really protection that they may be subject to. Yeah.
Do any of the other countries in the area, or West Africa, for example, have any stand on this issue, or they are quite silent?
Yeah, no, because I mean, what you have to bear in mind is that originally in 1975-76, everyone welcomed, the Western Sahara's right to organize a referendum and to become an independent state, because that's what all other African former colonial territories had been doing as well and had been allowed to do. So, therefore, certainly certain countries in southern Africa, mainly led by South Africa, have been very, very strong advocates, really, of the Polisario Front and of the right of the Western Sahrawis. So, they, for instance, they objected to Morocco joining the African Union. You had 9 states out of 54 that objected to Morocco joining, so Algeria, and then southern African states as well. And you can understand that because if South Africa is led by the ANC, you know, they considered really the Polisario Front as brothers in arms, really, more or less. You know. So it is happening, but not enough. That's what the problem is. Yeah.
I just want to ask you, I'm from the Canary Islands, so I'm just literally next door.
Yes.
And I can really notice that it's something it's not talking about, because I lived there for 18 years before coming to study here, and I never saw it in the news. It still doesn't appear. So you can ask any Canarian person, they have no clue what's happening next door. So I just want to ask you, like, do you know what are the current interests Spain has with regards to the Western Sahara, whether they're interested in them gaining independence or?
Briefly, no, because on the one hand, what you tend to have is that there are, I think Tom Young explains that very well in his recent book as well, there is an emotional reason sometimes why former colonial powers still take an interest in their former colonies. You know, Britain will still help provide development aid mainly to its former British territories and colonies, and there's not any other link than an emotional link. Tony Blair went to provide help, decided that Britain should intervene in Sierra Leone because he had an emotional link to Sierra Leone. His father taught in Sierra Leone and was the first intervention by Britain in Africa. And I think for Spain, I don't think that is the case for 2 reasons. For several reasons. One of them is the fact that Spain, of course, at the moment, you know, with Catalonia, is also really wrangling with this notion that you have certain autonomous territories that are possibly trying to break away as well from Spain. So that if you allow really, therefore, and you encourage certain territories from gaining statehood, that might cause some kind of precedent as well to say, well, the people here were allowed to decide, so why don't you allow the Catalan people as well to decide? And that's why it has opposed as well Kosovo, for instance. It is one of the only EU countries that is still opposed to Kosovo gaining independence, for instance, as well. And I think it has also taken much less of an interest than some of the other former colonial powers. France still intervenes now in Mali and Central African Republic, and you would not see that in Spain. The only link that I can see with Spain is that it's still concerned about its enclaves and doesn't want to let go, but now Ceuta and Melilla. Now it's slightly regretting it because of the refugees that are now trying to point to Spain or Europe through that way. But I remember as well when Parsley Island a few years ago, about 10, 15 years ago, so a small island off the Moroccan coast that Spain still controls, Island de Perejil or something like that, was occupied by Morocco because Morocco's coast was 100 yards away from it, and it was just a very tiny island of 200 yards long. It was just a small training base for Spain. Straight away they intervened as well because, but that's about it. I haven't heard much more. But I know that Polisario Front as well, it's an acronym for an expression in Spanish, so and I know therefore that Spain normally should be taking a greater interest as well in these territories where they still speak or would at least be inclined to speak more Spanish than French or English, but it hasn't really been the case. It doesn't
even really take into account or really pay any attention to the Sahrawi refugees that we receive in the islands. So
okay, yes,
so
yes.
If it doesn't when they come to us, then I don't think they really have an interest in them when they're in like the Western Sahara.
Yeah, that's right. And also at the end of the day, I think that they have got to try to maintain good relations with Morocco as well, you know, and because of its enclaves and other reasons, you know, I mean, it's the right of safe passage between the enclaves, for instance, you know, will be complicated if Spain was to intervene into these what Morocco possibly could consider internal matters as well. Yeah.
I just want to point out, because I'm from Somalia, that Somaliland is not actually a real country or an unrecognized state. It's a tribal state controlled by a tribe. Well, the vast majority of people have no choice in it. The only reason why it exists is because Somalia has no government that can effect any rule.
Okay.
So it's never going to be independent. The moment Somalia is fixed, it will be integrated back to the state.
The moment Somalia is fixed, yes, that's the big question. That's the big point.
So we don't know what's going to happen, but it will.
Yeah.
But talking about this, you had a point about colonial state, and Goa was taken by force by India, and so were the French enclaves by India as well. And right now, the issue with the Western Sahara is that, as you said, it's an emotional issue. A lot of people do care about it, but they're not invested in it. You know, Morocco is too important a partner. The European Union made a couple of trade deals with them. They involved like fishing off the coast of Western Sahara that were worth like hundreds of millions, twice.
Yeah.
And they didn't really care about Western Sahara because Western Sahara had no ability to affect any change. And because the conflict is kind of frozen, do you not think that instead of the Sahara is waiting for others to take interest into their concerns, they should maybe do something themselves? Instead of abiding by and wait for this referendum, maybe they should go back to fighting for their liberation.
Possibly, and also at the end of the day, all these issues are always concerned about what is in the interest of the people who are at the top. And here at the moment, it's about the Polisario front first and foremost, because they do not necessarily at the moment, their main concern is to also to retain some power and some control and a role possible, and to be one of the negotiating and important partners in this region, even if the people have to suffer from it as well and have to continue to be in the refugee camps. And at the end of the day, we know that the Sahrawi people, originally at least in 1950s, and so there was very little that distinguished them from, you know, other nomadic tribes in Mauritania and in Morocco. It's really in the last 20-30 years that the Sahrawi identity has really started emerging as well. But for a long time, Morocco had kind of this idea of the greater Maghreb idea, just like the greater Somalia idea originally as well in Somalia. My wife is from Somaliland. I know Somaliland. I've been there several times. So first, Somaliland, yes, has been for the last more than 20 years, has declared unilaterally independence following a referendum by the people in Somaliland. And at the moment, we still have general elections that are taking place. Most of the international observers are still considering that these are being done correctly. And so I think there's a lot of the will of the people that matters, because the people at the top initially didn't want independence. And the insurgency group, I've forgotten now, SNM? The SNM, initially, they wanted to remain part and play a role as well in Somalia. You still have regularly politicians from Somaliland who get a role in the governments in Somalia, so as to retain an inclusion and a clear indication that Somaliland is part of Somalia, as the Somalian constitution says it is. Somaliland wasn't allowed by the Somali constitution, of course, to break away from Somalia. But at the time when they made the decision to break away, it was when the SNM got together in Hargeisa. The people in the streets were there with machine guns and telling them, "We're going to kill you if you don't break away from Mogadishu. No more Mogadishu," is what they were shouting in the streets at the time. But of course, under international law, that doesn't really work. You can't really do that. You can't decide to break away as an entity just on your own and organize a referendum on your own, just in your own region. Just like Catalonia as well doesn't work under international law, because you would need a referendum in the whole of Spain as well for that to work under international law. So, but I'm saying that in practice, at least it is a de facto state, very much in the same in the same way as I've forgotten now the state in Asia as well is, but yeah, there we are. So.
Can I respond to that? The thing is that when Somalia did collapse, you had a lot of armed people, meaning they came from one tribe, they saw. So you do see people like who are armed in Hargeisa, city was destroyed by the dictators. So those people who were armed were people who already had like a single opinion, even before the state collapsed. They were against the government, so they would have forced it. But the fact is, there's a large part of Somaliland that have no agency. They know they're going to raise their voice, they'll get shot and killed, especially in the Western Sahara and the southern part of Somaliland. So those people are quiet because, as everyone knows, Somalia is not a stable country. So
I'm not saying that it is a perfect country.
Stable part of the northwest, and the rest of it is just chaos. So that's going to keep their mouth shut. But going back to Sahrawi, like the way the people differentiate themselves. The same thing happened with Eritrea, though. Like Eritrea historically was not like independent people. They didn't have like their own identity. That was only formed during the independence war that happened. Even though a lot of people who live in Eritrea have the same language, same custom, same ethnicity as the people who live on the other side of the Ethiopian border.
But you know fully well that for Eritrea, you had really at some point it was really this effort of ousting Mengistu, and that part of that agreement was really to allow and Meles to allow Zenawi, allowed therefore as well the agreement was to Eritrean Tigers that they should be allowed to break away and create their own state. And the Ethiopian constitution still has a right as well to break away from the country as well in its provisions. So I think there are similarities and differences. Overall, of course, what we would like is for everyone to live peacefully together. And overall as well, I would consider that the ordinary people will not see much of a difference whether Somaliland is part of Somalia and has got an autonomous powers, or whether it still remains an independent state. I think that would not necessarily have an impact for the people in the street. But of course, it is then the elites that will determine that what this political outcome should be. But I'm happy to talk to you about Somaliland further as well. But I know fully well that the southern part of Somalia, people are completely opposed to Somaliland breaking away. I haven't met any people from Somalia who are in favor of that. But I have also met a lot of people in Somaliland who talk about the Isaaq genocide and who talk about the mass graves that they still found 4 or 5 years ago after Isaaq's having been killed by the regime, the initial regime, and that there's a lot of suffering and hurt. But how do you deal with post-conflict situations? That's the holy grail. That's the ultimate question, really. Yeah. Okay.
Any other questions?
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.